And the question is, where are the definitive imperial numbers regarding the infamous Republicans and Democrats switch sides lie? I talked about this in Atlanta last week as I did a whole kind of a grand tour of progressivism. Here's the short form. Liberals will tell you that they're the tolerant ones and that Republicans are racist. And unfortunately for them, there are surviving records from the last century and the century before that. They haven't managed to eliminate all of those records yet. There are, in fact, surviving records. And what these records tell us is this. In 1856, the Republican Party was founded with John Fremont as the candidate for president. They were called the Black Republican Party. It was a slur. That's what the Democrats called the Republicans. Black Republican Party, because the Republican Party was based on the abolition movement. It was designed to help black Americans and free the slaves and help keep them free in the northern territories. In the next election cycle, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, won the election. And when Lincoln won the election, the 7 states of the Deep South, the original 7 states of the Confederacy, there were 4 more that were border states, but the 7 states of the Deep South were out of the Union before Lincoln took office. So think about that. Before Lincoln took office, the 7 states of the Confederacy were out of the Union. This idea that Lincoln forced them out of the Union, they were gone before he ever was sworn in. And he was gone. They were gone before he was sworn in because the southern states knew that the election of a Republican president meant the end of slavery in America. In 1864, with the Civil War or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on your point of view, still blazing away, the Democrats nominated George McClellan, former Army of the Potomac general and a brilliant organizer and a moral coward as far as actual using the Army he'd done so much to train. McClellan was the Democratic candidate, and McClellan basically, and the Democrats had a policy of the Constitution as it is and the Union as it was, which basically meant, hey, you know what, Confederacy, let's just call the whole thing off. Let's just say that it never happened. Come on back into the Union and bring your slaves with you. That was the Democratic policy in 1864. Bring your slaves back, and we'll just say it's a do-over. After the war, it was the Democrats, guys like Nathan Bedford Forrest in the South, who started the Ku Klux Klan. And in the years after the Ku Klux Klan, it was the Democrats in the South who wrote all the Jim Crow laws. They're all Democrats. And when you look at all the pictures of those protesters turning fire hoses and attack dogs on black kids trying to go to college, they were all done by Democrats. It was George Wallace and Lester Maddox and Bull Connor, all Democrats, all of them. And when you present this to the Democrats and progressives of today, they're confronted with the fact that Martin Luther King was a Republican. Frederick Douglass said that the Republican Party was the bedrock upon which the future of the black race was based. It's kind of embarrassing for them. So what they've done, what the progressives has done, is they've created this little piece of fiction, which is that's when the teams switch sides. Now you just think about this for a minute. The teams switch sides. They have to say ridiculous things like this because they can't live with their own history. Their own history is appalling and barbaric. So they'd say the teams switch sides. That's not a memo I ever got. And it's an absurd thing to say. It's a ridiculous thing to say. It's like saying we're winning at 72-0 at halftime, and we're going to go into the locker rooms, and we're going to change jerseys with the other team so that the Democrats can say, see, we're really the guys who really won the game after all. We were just wearing the wrong kind of jerseys. No, that's not what happened. What happened was, and if you want to argue with progressives about this, you have to use the actual quote. So I hope everybody's sitting down because I'm going to tell you what actually happened here. What happened was LBJ, the great progressive president, the father of the Great Society, the guy who launched the war on poverty, looked at the failure of the Democrats in their own base, the failure of the racist Democrats in the South. The Republicans were making gains in the South. And LBJ said, you know what, we've got to do something. And what LBJ, they switched sides all right, but it wasn't the way that they think about it. It wasn't like the Republicans and the Democrats switched constituents. What switched sides was the Democrats switched their strategy. The Democrats switched from being racists who invented KKK and Jim Crow and all the marriage laws that are involved with gay marriage or concatenation laws designed by Democrats to prevent black people from marrying white people. The Democrats came up with all this stuff, and to say they switched sides, they want to tell you that the Republicans became the Democrats and the Democrats became the Republicans and all the racists went from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Now we're not the racists. No. The Democrats switched sides, all right. They didn't switch sides. They switched strategies. And what they did was They said, you know what, without the black vote, we're never going to win again. We're a Southern party. And the Democrats decided to go from oppressing black people to buying their votes. And the operational quote here from that great progressive president, that magnificent Democratic champion of the little guy, was LBJ, who said, quote, "I'm going to have those niggers voting Democrat for the next 200 years," unquote. To make you flinch to hear that? It should make you flinch to hear that, because that's what they thought, and that's what they did. That's what they did. They went from oppressing black people to buying their vote. And they started all these giant social programs and started putting in all these other entitlement programs and welfare and all this other stuff. And it was a success. It was a success. Nowadays, if the Democrats don't carry 80 to 90% of the black vote, they never win a national election again. So the question is, has this been good for black people? Well, what do you think? You think black America is in better shape than it was in 1964? Because I don't. And if you really want to pound this point home, Zachariah and Allo, you need to go back even further. I talked about this this last weekend in Atlanta. I think the greatest tragedy in American history is not the Civil War, because the Civil War was fought to atone for a terrible sin. I think the greatest tragedy in American history happened after the Civil War and before LBJ. I think it happened at the beginning of the 20th century. And nobody talks about this, and of course they don't, because if you talk about this, then you will win this argument every time against these horrible racists and their bigotry of low standards. The great American tragedy in my mind, the single greatest American tragedy in my mind, was what happened in the great debate about the future of the black race in America in the years following the Civil War. And the great debate took place among two champions. Two gladiators went to bat here. They were both black gladiators, both African Americans in the world 20, 30, 40 years after the Civil War ended. One of them was a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was a black intellectual, and his position was, white people owe us, and what we'll do is we will petition them and use guilt against them, and we will basically say, give to us money and political power, and then we meaning the what he termed, this is his term, not our term. W.E. Du Bois said to white America, give us some money, give us some power, and we, the talented 10th, that's the term he used, the talented 10th, will distribute and administer this upon the rest of black America and raise them up out of their condition of ignorance and servility. The talented 10th. What he basically meant was the black elite would do all the lifting, so give us all the money and all the power, and that was W.E.B. Du Bois's position. Now, standing up opposite him was, I think, the greatest unsung American in our history, and that man's name was Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington had the precise opposite position. Booker T. Washington basically said, if they give it to us, we haven't earned it. If they give it to us, they'll resent us. And if they give it to us, they will not respect us. Booker T. Washington's theory was pretty clear. Booker T. Washington said, we are the descendants of slaves. The children of slaves, and slaves, the former slaves, are going to have to go back, in many cases, back to the very plantation they just were liberated from, and go back and work as farmers. Booker T. Washington said, this generation is going to have to work as farmers so that their children can become mechanics and so that their children can become doctors. And what Booker T. Washington said was, we cannot expect any respect or any equality if it is given to us. We're going to have to work for it, and we're going to have to earn it. Booker T. Washington said, black America is going to have to develop its own economy. We're going to have to develop our own source of revenue. We're going to have to be farmers and mechanics and all of these things. And we're not going to come knocking at the door with our hat in our hand. We're going to come in as equals with money, and we're going to buy the things that we need, and we're going to show white America that we can compete with them in exactly the same level. It's going to take 3 generations, but we'll get there. Booker T. Washington had this theory. And Booker T. Washington didn't just have a theory, and this is why this argument is so important, because it's not about theory. It's not about theory. It's not about, gee, they could have done this, because racists can say, no, they never could have done it. If you're a racist, you think, well, Booker T. Washington says they're going to come in on the same level as white people, racists, and there were a lot of them in the country, and they're all Democrats, because Republicans were founded to make black people equal. But the racist Democrats would have said, you know what? No, you can say all you want to, Booker T. Washington, but blacks are inferior. We all know it. Well, Booker T. Washington didn't want to have his word taken, so basically Booker T. Washington raises some money, and he starts something called the Tuskegee Institute, a little school in Alabama. You know what? You know what's remarkable about the Tuskegee Institute? The Tuskegee Institute demanded from black students, from black Americans, that they would not only have to perform to the standards of white Americans, they'd have to do better. And he told them why they'd have to do better. So it may not seem fair to you, but that's not about fair. We will not be accepted in this society until we show these people we're not only as good as they are, but we're better when we put our mind to it. And that was his attitude at the Tuskegee Institute. And imagine your surprise and mine when you find out that black students at the Tuskegee Institute had higher test scores than the white average, and not only higher test scores, they had higher legitimacy rates. They had higher rates of marriage, more within marriage births than the white population. They weren't just smarter students, they were better people by every measure of the term. They were more moral people, they were more religious, they had stronger families, not weaker ones. And when finally the Tuskegee Institute gets involved in World War II, we get the Tuskegee Airmen, which was a fighter squadron with substandard equipment at the beginning of the war, substandard training throughout the war, probably substandard pay. And the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, never lost a bomber, escorting a bomber, never once. And what's profound about that is this. You could have said to white Americans, you are going to have to respect these black pilots who are flying off of your wing. And white pilots who are racist would have said, you know what? We're not respecting anybody. That's not how it happened. The Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber. They were so superb as fighter pilots that the white pilots who they were escorting had to respect them because they were coming home to their wives and children because of these black warriors out there. That's how you earn respect. And that's exactly how they earned respect in the Civil War with the 54th Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts was an abolitionist regiment formed of free blacks in Massachusetts. It went to fight in the Civil War. Not only we know how the Confederates felt about black soldiers and black people in general, but the Union soldiers thought that black soldiers were inferior. And if you've seen Glory, it's an amazing movie. What you find is the 54th Massachusetts went and stormed Battery Wagner in South Carolina, I want to say. And when those black soldiers marched past their white Union counterparts, they were sneered and jeered at and called monkeys and all the rest. And then they went out there and then they did the exact same heroic bleeding and dying and fighting that the white soldiers did. And when that battle was over and everybody came back blooded, and many of them didn't come back, including the commander of that regiment, whose name not Strong Vincent, whatever. I'll get it in a minute. Somebody will tell me. It's a young guy. It's right on the Robert. It'll come to me. Anyway, when that battle was over, the white soldiers who watched these black men go into battle on both sides, the Confederate side and the Union side, said these are not animals and these are not savages. These are heroic men and they fight and take bullets just as good as white people. The most poignant comment in the entire Civil War for me by far was written by a Southern racist slaveholder Firebrand, one of these guys who started the war. And we were getting towards the end of the Civil War. It was 1864, maybe even 1865, and things were so desperate for the Confederacy. The Confederacy was absolutely out of manpower. They lowered the age, they raised the conscription age, and they were out of people. The North still had millions and millions and millions of college students rowing, for Harvard, and they never got called up. But the South was out of men. And so there was serious consideration in the South, supported by Robert E. Lee, I think, later anyway, to arm slaves and maybe even make them free as a condition of their serving in the Confederate armies. And this Confederate member of the Confederate Congress, this racist politician, said, this is the most profound quote of the war in my opinion. He said, if blacks make good soldiers, then our entire theory of slavery is wrong. In other words, if it turns out that these slaves of ours go out there and can think and can act tactically, that they can take a look at Robert Gould Shaw, thank you, Commander 54, thanks, Lord Teo. If black soldiers can use tactics and strategy, if they have the courage and the heroism necessary to go out and storm these positions, if they can think about something other than themselves, fight for their future, all of these things, if black soldiers do that, this Confederate said, then our entire theory of slavery is wrong. We shouldn't have a Confederacy in the first place. That is a profound, profound, profound observation. And sure enough, blacks did make good soldiers, and sure enough, their entire theory of slavery was wrong. So This business about Republicans and Democrats switching sides is not true. What switched was the Democrats went from oppressing black people to owning them as slaves by buying their vote. Democratic Party is the largest slaveholding organization in the world today. There are, 20 million, 30, 40 million black Americans in slavery held by the Democratic Party. They're given free food, free housing, free accommodations, some stipend for their rent and a little bit of spending money. They're given cheap phones, and all they have to do is work for 1 or 2 hours every 2 years. They're on a vote plantation. And the great, 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 great tragedy of American history was that black America followed the easy path, the seductive easy path of W.E.B. Du Bois, and didn't take the hard road of Booker T. Washington that would have brought them into society as equals. Not in our eyes, in their own eyes. In their own eyes. They would have achieved things because Booker T. Washington wouldn't let them achieve less. Respect is not given. You have to earn it. And as far as the talented 10th goes, we still have the talented 10th, Barack Obama's a measure of a member of the talented 10th, and Al Sharpton is one of the talented 10th, and Jesse Jackson is one of the talented 10th. They're people who get go to the Great White Father and come back with the bacon and distribute it to their people, and they get to be big men, and they have fantastic, funny haircuts, and they ride around in big cars and impress themselves and everybody else. Yeah, it's a great plan if you're one of the talented 10th, and they move out of the black neighborhoods, by the way. Reverend Wright is one of the talented 10th. He railed against white America his entire life, and the second he had money to retire, the first thing he does is get out of that ghetto he was in Chicago and go live among the white people in a gated community. They're hypocrites, and they're liars, and they're evil, and they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. They're keeping their own people in slavery. Both the whites and the blacks are keeping black people in slavery in exchange for their political power base. It's a catastrophe, and it's a disaster, and it's evil, and it's got to be fought. And that's how you fight it. It's the biggest lie in the country, by far.